What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial Series, we are going to be going over crouch walking. So crouch walking is a funny mechanic that can be very useful for certain characters, particularly charged characters. And a good example of this is Guile from Street Fighter V. He has the ability to crouch walk and charge attacks while he crouches. So if I come in here, into the game, I can crouch and press forward to start crouch walking. I walk at a slower rate than my standard walk, but I can do other actions while I am crouch walking. Now I don't have any attacks or anything like that at the moment, but again, you could set it up to how you like. If you want to use the crouch input to charge up an attack, we have the ability to do that in the series already, so feel free to play around with it and do as you please. Both characters can do this, and you can only crouch walk forward. You can't crouch walk backward. Additionally, since I can't go back, I can't automatically block. Additionally, since I can't crouch walk backward, I can't automatically block either. So if I'm sitting still, I can crouch block like this, but I can't be like walking and then somehow automatically block. Before we get into the episode, if you're interested in getting caught up in the series, I'll link you to the playlist right here in the top right corner. We are at episode 203, so we're very far along, but we still have a long way to go. If you're only interested in the crouch walk mechanic, then I will recommend that you watch this video right here, which is the standard crouching logic. We will be going off of this logic to make today's episode, so if you want a head start on that logic instead of trying to copy it all while I'm writing this, you can go ahead and check that out and get caught up. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series, so we're going to go into the code to start, and specifically I want to go to my fighter template character.h or my base character.h file. The first thing I want to do when we get in here is determine if this character can even crouch walk. Crouch walking is a very limited feature and not a lot of characters can do it. Unless you want all your characters to be able to do it, we are going to have to disable this or enable it for certain characters. So the first thing we need is a boolean to determine that. I'm going to scroll down to where I put my boolean variables in this file. I've created a new one for today's episode called can crouch walk right here. And it's literally, can this character perform crouch walk? I've made it U property. Edit anywhere, blueprint read write with a category of movement, so we can both see it and edit it in the blueprint. Again, that is bool can crouch walk, and this determines if the character can crouch walk at all. If it's false, we just won't allow the character to go into any of the crouch walk states, thus not allowing them to actually crouch walk. It's that simple. The other thing that I will want to add is an enum state for the crouch walk, so I'm going to scroll up to the top of my file. I have this e character state enum, and it just basically tracks what state the character is in. I already have crouching and crouch blocking, but I've added a new one today for crouch walking. So just go ahead and add a new element in the list, e_crouch walking. I gave it a u meta display name of crouch_walking. So that's how it will show up in the blueprint and animation blueprint, things like that. Once we have this, we have the ability to put the character into the state, so we're good to go. Now we can go into the fighter template character.cpp and scroll down to the constructor where we set all of our default values for our variables. In here, I've set can crouch walk to be true. Now, by default, this actually means that all characters will be able to crouch walk. For this demo, it's perfectly fine, but make sure you change it. If you want most of your characters not to be able to crouch walk, I'd set it to false by default. Regardless, at this point, our character will be able to crouch walk. So now what we want to do is determine when the character should be in the crouch walking state. The best place to go to actually set this behavior up is in move right, because move right handles our movement and our walking anyway. While we are crouching, it's a little bit different, but at the same time, it is still going to handle our movement. Here's my move right function. In here we do a lot of logic, but basically we get our game instance and get the controller for the character, then determine if that controller is using a gamepad or not. If they are using a gamepad, we actually send them to the move right controller function. If they're not, we stay here in the move right function. Then we check to see if the character is not crouching or crouch blocking. And we do this because we are trying to add inputs to the input stack. This is for things like practice and training mode. You can follow this if statement down because we don't have to change anything in here right now. Then we'll get to this else eventually, and this is the logic for the crouching behavior. We're going to keep going through this as well. Now we'll get to an area where we're checking for recoveries and buttons pressed during these actions. We can skip past that too. And finally, we'll get to this logic right here. In this if statement, we were checking to make sure that we weren't crouching, crouch blocking, and we had no combo state on us, and we had the ability to move. If all these things were true, we were going to determine what state the character should be put into, either moving backward or forward, and then actually apply the forces and the velocity to the character so that they can move. I've made an adjustment on here to include crouch walking, make sure that we are not crouch walking when performing this. And that is because this is all of our regular movement. We don't want to do regular movement. When we're crouch walking, we want to use the crouch walking state, and we also want to have a slower speed. It's a little bit different than the regular walking, and I don't want to treat it the same. So in this if statement where you check for these states before determining if the character is moving backward or forward, go ahead and add an additional condition in here to check the character state is not equal to e character state : e underscore crouch walking. We are going to handle the crouch walking logic below this if statement, so we just want to skip this entirely if we are in crouch walking. I can now scroll down to the bottom of this if statement, so I'm going to follow it down. And eventually we get to this else if right here. This else if is essentially the opposite. We do still check to see if we can move or not. However, we check to see if the character state is equal to crouching or is equal to crouch blocking. Now, I've added an additional check in here, or the character state is equal to crouch walking. If it's equal to any of those, we can enter this logic. So essentially, in the if statement above, we're checking to make sure that the character state is not crouch walking. In this else if, we're checking to see if it's crouching, crouch blocking, or crouch walking. So you have to add that character state check to those two if statements. If we are in crouching, crouch blocking, or crouch walking, we go into this behavior right here. In this behavior, we were determining what input was pressed, either right or left. Then we were determining, based on the direction the character was facing, if that was their forward or their backward. Right? So left and right always stay the same, no matter what direction the characters are facing. However, to them, forward and backward change, because forward is moving in the direction they are facing, and backward is moving away from the direction they are facing. So in this first example, we were determining if the player was pressing to the right. That's what this means. Value is the value that is passed into this function, basically the input axis value. So either negative 1.0 or 1.0. So if value is greater than 0.01f, it's a value greater than 0, it's to the right. So it's to the right, and the character is not facing right. That means that is a backward input they are pressing, because if they're going to the right and they're facing to the left, that means that is a backward input. In here, we were setting is pressing backward to be true because it was a backward input. But now I've added this logic right here for today's episode. If the character presses backward while they are crouched, we don't want them to be able to crouch walk. So if the character is currently in the crouch walking state, we want to reset them back to the standard crouching state. Basically, the character pressed backward while crouching. Since they can't crouch walk backward, we just put them to the regular crouching state. So if the character state is equal to crouch walking, character state equals crouching. Now, else, this else statement means that the character is facing right, and we already know that the value was to the right, so they are moving in the direction they are facing, which means they are pressing forward. Before in the series, we were saying is pressing forward equals true, because we knew this was a forward input. But for today's episode, I've added this behavior right here. We know that we are in the crouching state, and we're pressing in the direction we're facing, so that would be the crouch walk command if our character could do so. The first thing we need to check is if the character is able to crouch walk at all. So if can crouch walk. If this is true and they have the ability to crouch walk, we want to set the character state to e_crouch walking. Once the character is in that state, we can apply the appropriate movement input. Let's scroll up for a second. This add movement input is right above the else if that we're working in, so this is the standard walking movement input. The way it works is it has an F vector in the direction that we want to move. We're trying to move on the y-axis, and then it gets multiplied by this value right here. So if it's a -1, we walk one direction. If it's a +1, we walk the other direction. You can either copy that line and paste it in the crouching behavior or write it out yourself, but we want to call add movement input. We want to make a new F vector. We still want to move on the y-axis, so the x-axis is 0.0f, y-axis is 1.0f, and the z-axis is 0.0f. And we still want to use the value that the player was pressing to determine what direction we want to move. With that said, however, I don't want the crouching to be as fast as the walking, so I've made it half as fast as the walking by multiplying the value by 0.5. Let's go to the other condition. So if the value is not greater than 0.01f, that is this else if right here, else if the value is less than negative 0.01f. That means the player is pressing the input to the left. If this is the case, we were checking the direction and we were checking to see if the character was facing right. If they're pressing to the left and they're facing right, that is a backward input. So previously in the series, we were setting is pressing backward to be true. For today's episode, I've added the same behavior as you saw above. Since we are pressing backward and crouching, we don't want to be able to crouch walk backward. So if the character state is crouch walking, we want to end that and set the character state back to regular crouching. If we go to the else here, that means the character is not facing right, which means they are facing left. So if the player is pressing to the left and the character is facing left, the player is pressing in the direction the character is facing, which means they were pressing forward, and we already determined that earlier in the series. For today's episode, I've added that same behavior that you saw just a minute ago. And so now we have to set the character to be in the crouch walking state, but only if they can crouch walk. So we check if can crouch walk, and if they can, we know they're in the proper condition to do so. So we're going to set the character state to be character state : E underscore crouch walking. Then we do need to add the movement in that direction. It is the same line as before. Add movement input, F vector, 0.0, 1.0, 0.0, and then the value, and I multiply it by 0.5 just to make it a little bit slower than the regular walk speed. Now, there's an else below that for these value checks. So if the value is not greater than 0.01 and the value is not less than 0.01f, that means the value is either 0 or within the dead zone range, in which case we're not registering any input. We're going to say the player is not pressing anything. That is this else statement right here. So let's scroll down to this else statement. Before in the series, we realized that if we're not pressing anything or we're not registering that input, then is pressing backward and is pressing forward should be false at this point. Since we're saying there's no input, we don't want to be in the crouch walking state anymore. If the character has released the buttons, then we want to set the character back to the crouching state. We know they're still crouching, but they're not pressing left or right. They're not pressing a directional input. So we check to see if the character state is crouch walking, and if it is, just set them back to the regular crouching state. Now, that's everything for move right. I know it's quite complicated, but we're going to get to see another example of it because I'm going to do it live in move right controller. So move right controller only functions if we are using a gamepad, and if we are, we want to grab all of our input stack behavior. So here's my if statement for that. I'm going to follow it down. I'm going to get to an else statement, and this is the crouching input stack behavior. We're going to follow this to the end. Then we get into behavior for recoveries, knockdowns, and things like that. And we finally get to an if statement where we're checking for if we're crouching, crouch blocking, blocking, we have no combo state, and we can move. If we can do all those things, then we know that we are going to want to move the character. I want to do crouch walking now, and crouch walking is going to be slightly different, so I don't want to handle it in here. So I don't want to say the character can go into this if they are crouch walking. So I want to add an and character state, not equal to E character state, : E underscore crouch walking. So we won't go into this if statement, our regular movement if statement, if we're crouch walking. So now let's scroll down to the else related to this if statement, which is right here, this else if. And in this else if, we were checking to see if we could move, and if we can move, then we were checking to see if we were crouching or crouch blocking. We want to go into this logic now for crouching, crouch blocking, or character state equal E character state, : E underscore crouch walking. Because if we're crouch walking, we can go into this behavior. Now, if the value is greater than 0.2f, that means we are going to the right. If we are not facing to the right, we want to update this because since we're pressing backward, we don't want to be able to crouch walk in that direction. So if the character state equal e character state e underscore crouch walking, we no longer want to be in the crouch walking state. We're pressing backward. So we want to set the character state to be the regular crouching state. There we go. However, if we go into the else, this means we are pressing to the right and we are facing to the right, which is a forward input. So we want to check to see if the character can crouch walk. Most importantly, because if they can't, we don't want to do this logic. But if we can crouch walk, we want to then set the character state to be equal to e character state e underscore crouch walking. We also would like to add the movement input at this point. To do this, we can call add movement input. We want to make an f vector, and we want it to be 0.0f on the x-axis, 1.0f on the y-axis, 0.0f on the z-axis. Then we want to pass in the value that was passed in a move right controller, and to make it a little bit slower than a regular walk speed, I'm going to multiply it by half, or multiply it by 0.5f. I'm going to also write this comment just to be consistent, add movement in that direction, because this comment is everywhere in the move right function where we call add movement input, so why not keep it? And there we go. Now, if we go down to the else statement for the value section, this was pressing to the right. This means this is pressing to the left. So else if the value is less than negative 0.2f, we're pressing to the left above the dead zone amount, and we're facing to the right, that would be a backward input. So if that's a backward input, we don't want to be able to crouch walk in that direction. So you probably know it by now, but now we're going to check to see if the character state is already equal to e character state e underscore crouch walking. And if it is, we no longer want to be. We want to set them back to the standard e character state e underscore crouching. Now the else is facing right means they are facing left. If they are pressing left and facing left, that is a forward input. So we want to check to see if the character can crouch walk. And at this point, if they can, we know that they should be. So we want to set the character state to be e character state e underscore crouch walking. So now the character is crouch walking, and if they're crouch walking, we want to add movement in that direction. And that means we want to call add movement input, passing in an f vector that we create, 0.0f on the x-axis, 1.0f on the y-axis, 0.0f on the z-axis, and we want to pass in the value that was passed in the move right controller, then multiply that by half to make it a little bit slower than the regular walk speed. Now we want to go to the else, which is else if the player is not pressing right, not pressing left, or they haven't pressed the stick outside the dead zone, in which case we were setting both of our pressing forward, pressing backward variables to false. So we're assuming there's no input in this case, and in which case we don't want to be able to keep crouch walking if the character has released the forward part of the down forward required for crouch walking. So we want to just set the character state back to e character state e underscore crouching. But we only want to do this if the character state is already the crouch walking state, because otherwise if we're crouch blocking or something like that, then it would reset us to crouching, which we wouldn't want to do at this point. So that's move right and move right controller with the basic behavior in. There is one other thing I'd like to do in the code for crouch walking, just to clean up any loose ends. So I've gone to the top of the file here, and I'm going to search for my e underscore crouching state. The reason I'm going to do this is because I want to find everywhere where we are using crouching or crouch blocking, and I want to check to see if we need to incorporate crouch walking into this. So the first result I get is in the jump function for the character. Basically, we're trying to not put the character into the jumping state if they're crouching, crouch blocking, or in some sort of combo state or can't jump or have already used their max jumps. At this point, I think we should add the crouch walking check, because we don't want to be able to jump if we're crouch walking if we weren't allowing the player to jump if they're crouching or crouch blocking. So I'm going to go ahead and add an and in here and say character state not equal to e character state underscore crouch walking. So we can't jump if we're crouch walking. All right, let's go to the next e crouching. And this is in the start crouching function. So we were setting the character state to be crouching if we were not equal to blocking and not equal to crouch blocking upon pressing the down input. That's fine. We don't have to do anything here with crouch walking, so we can just ignore it. Next one is in start manually blocking. So we were letting the character go to the standard blocking state if the character wasn't crouching or crouch blocking. Otherwise, they were going to the crouch blocking state. I think if you manually block from crouch walking, you should be able to exit out of crouch walking and go to crouch blocking. If that's the case, and you want to do that too, then we do want to check and make sure that we are not crouch walking before sending the player to the standard blocking state. Otherwise, if we do that, they will exit out of the crouch walk and go to the standing block. So instead, let's do and character state not equal to e character state underscore crouch walking. Let's go to the next one. Start automatically blocking. This is the same deal. It's the same behavior. It's just that the automatic block doesn't require a button press. However, we should not be able to block while crouch walking. The only reason the manual block worked is because you manually press a button, which is going to tell the character to stop crouch walking and start crouch blocking. Basically, they can't block while pressing backward while they're crouch walking. You don't have to worry about it here. If you want to add it for peace of mind, by all means, go for it. In fact, I probably will, because I think it'll be a little bit cleaner. However, this is never going to take effect as long as we do all of our logic correctly. It should never reach this state while we're going into an automatic block. But we put it in there anyway, just to keep things clean and make sure that there are no issues. Next one is stop manually blocking. And this is the same deal, just the reverse. So if we're not crouching and not crouch blocking, we return to idle. But if we were crouching or crouch blocking, we go back to the crouching state. Again, this is when we release the button. So if we release the manual block button and we're not crouching or not crouch blocking, we were going to the default state. Else we were going to the crouching state. This is another case where you shouldn't ever be able to stop manually blocking while you're crouch walking, because you shouldn't be able to block while you're crouch walking. So it doesn't really make sense. These are two different states. Can't be in them both at the same time. But if you'd like, you could add the crouch walking in here. Again, to stay consistent, we can add it just so there's no weird bugs that ever come up, but this really should never happen, period. So this is just an extra check that we don't necessarily need. But I'm going to opt to do it just to keep things clean. So we know if we're in any crouching state, we'll return to the regular crouch once we stop manually blocking. The next one is stop automatically blocking. I already see it right here. And in which case, I'll go ahead and add the same thing, because why not? All right. Now the next one is in move right, and it's at the very top here for the input stack behavior. So it adds inputs to the input buffer and input stack regardless of what the character is currently doing. So we were checking to see if the character was not in the crouching or crouch blocking state. This is how we were determining if we should do diagonals like down right, down left. If we want to continue to use this logic like this, I would recommend that we go ahead and update this to include the crouch walking, because again, this is just for the input stack, so in practice, where we can see the inputs the player pressed. If they are crouch walking, they can still press other inputs like down, they can press back, they can press forward, they can press their attacks. All this should still print, and it should be the appropriate directions that the player was pressing regardless of state. But it is important to know that they are crouch walking, so that is factored into it. So I go ahead and add this check in here. Let's continue along. Now this one is the important one for today's episode. This one had to be in, otherwise our logic would not work. So we've already covered this one in move right. Next one, this is the other important one in move right. This is where we were checking to see if we were crouching and where we actually implemented the crouch walking behavior. So we've already done this one. And these are all part of move right. We did it in today's episode. Now we have move right controller, and this is the same deal. This is checking to see what state we're in for the input stack. I'm going to go ahead and add the check to make sure that the character state is not equal to e character state : e underscore crouch walking. Might as well. Then let's keep looking. This is the one we did in move right controller. You'll see crouch walking is already there. This is the else if in move right controller. Again, you'll see crouch walking is already there. And all of these are going to be the ones in move right controller we did in today's episode. Now we have end stun. And in here, it was determining what state we should go to when the stun ends. So if we were manually blocking and we weren't crouching or crouch blocking, we were going to return to the default block state once stun ended. Again, this is one that really shouldn't come up because you can't be blocking when you are crouch walking. So for consistency and make sure there are no bugs that come up, we can check and make sure that the character state is not equal to e character state, e crouch walking. However, this shouldn't be required, so that's just a safeguard. We'll go ahead and do it in here as well. So this top one was for manually blocking. This would be for automatically blocking. Again, should not happen when crouch walking, but this will ensure that if it does, for any reason, if we make a mistake, it will still get caught and fixed. And now we're back to jump. So we've successfully put crouch walking everywhere that it needs to go. At this point, we can go ahead and relaunch the editor. The editor is back open, so now we want to go into our animation blueprint so that we can add this crouch walking animation. Here's my mutant anim BP. No changes are required in the event graph today. All we really need to do is add a state called crouch walk. So right click, add state, and then you can call it whatever you want. Again, crouch walk is fine. I've already got one called crouch walk right here. It has no state events or anything fancy. If we go into it, it is this crouch walking animation. So very simple. It is set to loop because it is a walking animation after all, so it can loop as long as the character is walking. Then we want to determine what states it can go to or what states can go to it. So in my case, I don't have anything super complicated. I have the ability to go from crouch to crouch walk and crouch walk back to crouch. So crouch to crouch walk is a transition rule. No transition events, nothing like that. And it's very simple. We just want to check to see if the character state is crouch walking. So if we're already crouching and the character state updates to crouch walking, then we will play the crouch walking animation. To get this, you just grab your character reference, get your character state, check if it's equal enum to crouch walking, and then pass that into the result can enter transition. We can also go from crouch walk back to crouch. Again, no transition events. It's very simple. We're going to do the same thing we just did in the previous transition rule, but we're going to check for crouching instead of crouch walking because we're going from crouch walk back to regular crouch. Now, I do have the ability to go from crouch walk to idle as well, because if we release the crouch button, I want to go to idle. Idle will automatically take us to the other movement states. So if we are holding the right button still and we release crouch, we could walk forward or do whatever we need to when we get to idle, but we should be able to exit crouch walk directly to idle by releasing crouch. So I have crouch walk to idle, and that is a transition rule right here. Again, no transition events, very simple. And here I'm just going to check and make sure there are no crouching states that I could be in. So I grab my character reference, grab my character state variable. I check to make sure I'm not equal to, exclamation mark equal to, not equal enum. And we have to check for all the states we care about. We don't want to go from crouch walk to idle just because we're not crouching. Because if we're in the crouch walk state, our state could still be crouch walking. So we don't want to just leave because we're not crouching. We don't want to go to idle if we're crouch blocking, because then we could go from crouch walking to crouch blocking. This is specifically if we do our manual block, but it's still important. If we do that, we don't want to go to idle, we want to go to crouch block. And we don't want to just check if we're not crouch walking to go to idle, because what if we release the input and we end up in regular crouch? So we're still holding down, but we release our directional input. That means we should stop crouch walking and we should go to regular crouch. So we have to be not crouching, not crouch blocking, and not crouch walking to be able to go to idle. And to check all of these, you can drag off one of your booleans, type and bool, and add a pin to have 3, and just pass them all in. Then pass the result in here. And while we're in here, let's go ahead and add that crouch walk to crouch manual block. So this is my new transition rule, crouch walk to crouch manual block. We can set this up, we can get our character reference, and we can drag off of it and grab the character state. Then we can drag off of that and check to see if we're equal to crouch blocking. Now, if we are, we will be able to go to this state. And we don't really need to be able to exit from crouch manual block to crouch walk. Should be fine without doing that, because we can go to crouch and then crouch can immediately go to crouch walk. I'm going to make a quick edit here, because while that is true, we can actually go from crouch manual block to crouch when we reach the crouching state. But since we can go to the crouch walking state on the same frame that we were in crouch blocking, this will actually cause an issue where we will move while in the crouch manual block state. So we do actually want to have a transition rule from crouch manual block to crouch walk as well. So I'm going to add this here. And we're going to use the same that we use for crouch to crouch walk, which is just checking the crouch walking state. So I'm going to promote this one to shared, call it crouch walk. And then on the crouch manual block to crouch walk, use that shared transition rule. There is one more thing we should do if we really want to use this crouch block and the crouch walking to crouch block mechanic. So we're going to go back to the code and we want to go to our move right function where we set the crouch walk character state. So you can see here's my if statement. We're going to scroll down to the else if right here. And in here, we were setting the character state to be the crouch walk state on this line. So what we really want to do is make sure that we're not blocking, because if we are blocking, we don't want to be able to crouch walk. We may be able to override it and exit the crouch block to go into crouch walk. If we do that, that should only be when we press the button, and I don't think you should be able to do it at all since you're manually blocking. You have to release the block first. So in this case, I want to check to see if the character state is not equal to e character state : _ e crouch walking before setting the state. There is one other thing we want to do. We don't want to just do this for setting the state. We want to do it for all the crouch walking logic, such as the add movement input. So we actually want to encompass everything inside of this if can crouch walk if statement in this other if statement. And at this point, we want to do this for everywhere that we set the character state to be crouch walking. So I am going to scroll down a little bit to my next section, which is still in this move right function, but it's for the other direction. And when we do this, you'll see that we have this can crouch walk where we're setting the character state. We want to add the same check in here. So we just want to check and make sure the character state is not equal to crouch blocking. Then encompass everything in here and we'll be good to go. We also want to do this for our move right controller where we're setting crouch walking as well. So here's move right controller. Here's the big if statement. And then here is the else if, and in here is where we're setting the crouch walking state, so you already know what to do. And once we check for this, we want to make sure we put everything in here inside of the brackets, inside of the curly braces. And then we have one more section in move right controller to perform the same if check. And that will be all of our cases covered. So we can go back and start the editor once again and test out the crouch block and crouch walk behavior. To make sure everything is working as intended, we can go to our mutant BP And this is my player 1, so we can search for character state. And I can say crouching. If I'm walking, I'm crouch walking. If I release the crouch, I'm moving forward. If I am crouch walking and I release the walking part of it, I'm just crouching. We can also go from crouch walking to crouch blocking, and once we release the block, we can continuously walk. So anyway guys, that's all I got for you today. That's how you can implement crouch walking in your game. You have a lot more you can do with it if you'd like, such as adding those charge attacks. But if you enjoyed and this helped you make your crouch walk, then please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. You guys are so incredibly amazing, and I am so grateful for you. Thank you for all the love and support, and for all the help over the years. If you need any help or ran into any issues with watching this video, then feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description and it is completely free. Anyway guys, thank you so much again. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye guys.